Welcome to Saturday. Welcome to our Startup Sprint Day 2. Thank you very much for joining us. Just a few housekeeping notes. Before we get started, super housekeeping, the washrooms are outside on each side of the staircase. And the number one question we get asked is, will these slides be made available to us? So yes, they will be made available to us on our website. Just give us a couple days to get them up, but yeah, they'll be made available to you. We also are streaming this online, so good morning to those watching online. First, I would like to just say we are very grateful to be here on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and we are very thankful for that. Not yet. I would also like to just thank our sponsors, and it's because of them that we get to do things like this. So we're very thankful for them too. Innovate BC is our lead sponsor. Gold sponsors, let's see if I can do this by memory. EY, Fasken, SFU Beauty School of Business, hosting us here today, and the UBC Sutter School of Business. Our silver sponsors are Volition, Vantech, Angel Network, and TELUS Ventures. And then we have lots of bronze sponsors that you can see listed down here. And also, for those online, we do have slido.com if you want to ask questions throughout, and we will do our best to ask some of them to our speakers. If you are here in person, you can also use Slido to ask your questions. However, if you just want to do it the old-fashioned way and put your hand up, we will just bring a mic to you so we can catch the question online for the audience there. Otherwise, I think those are all my housekeeping duties. So that's it. So I'm still out of practice with in-person still. So it's my pleasure, actually. So Spring is a accelerator here in town, focusing social venture, social enterprises. Is that fair to say? Yeah. So we've been partners with Spring for a very, very long time, and they do all sorts of great programming, including a lot of investor challenges, which I'm sure Keith will tell you about. But one of my favorite things about Spring is this very specific topic on funding fundamentals. I think it's a really wonderful and pragmatic overview. So I'm very happy that Keith and Spring are here to go through the material with you today. So I'm going to switch the slides.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Awesome. I really appreciate you taking this Saturday to hang out with me. I've actually been looking forward to this all week. We, according to the Canadian government, are officially over on COVID, but it still feels like we're getting back into the rhythm of a lot of these things, including in person. And so for me, I'm just absolutely thrilled to be here today. I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking to you about funding fundamentals. So as we get started, thank you very much. I'm just out of curiosity, how many people have raised angel investment or venture capital before? Cool, awesome, thank you. Okay, so most of us are first timers, which is great. I love a lot of questions and a lot of discussions. So I think the topic that we have today is the kind of topic that actually triggers a lot of questions and conversation. So please don't hesitate, throw your hand up. For the people online, use Slido, or if you're modest, you can use Slido here as well. Let me see if I can do this. Or not. I have one slide for 90 minutes, just saying. It's like magic. I know it was, yeah. See if that helps. Unless it's because of PowerPoint. Oh, there we go. Fabulous. So thank you, Angie. Again, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional and unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations, and very honored and humbled to live and work here. Okay, you guys saw that. Okay, here we go. I have to apparently stand very close. All right, so let's see if I can pull this off. So thanks to Angie and New Ventures BC for hosting us today. And I'm going to figure out how close. Maybe I need to be right over here. I'll stand right here. Just kidding. Okay, so just to tell you a little bit about Spring, we exist to change the world through innovation. We love to work at the intersection of impact and tech. So typically speaking for us, that means climate solutions, clean tech, circular economy, healthcare and health tech, a little bit of education and ed tech, fintech, progressive food and agri-tech, and then what we call sustainable supply chain e-com and marketplace. So that's a little bit about us. We're headquartered in Vancouver. We have an office in Toronto. We have people on the island, Winnipeg, Halifax, and San Francisco. We've trained more than 2,000 entrepreneurs, helped to launch more than 500 companies. And we've worked in more than 50 communities, actually just cleared 60 communities around the world, spanning South and Southeast Asia, Latin America, Southeast Europe, MENA region, and a little bit of Western Europe as well. So we've had the good fortune of working across Canada, of course, as a part of that. And hey, there we go. And then over the last about 4 years, we have been very active in building the early stage impact investing community in Canada. So those people who are generally speaking investing pre-seed, seed, early A, individual angel investors, family offices, corporate venture capital firms, to really bring capital into Impact Plus Tech in these sectors that I've been talking about. So as a part of that, last year we launched the Spring Investing Collective, which is Canada's largest early stage impact investing network. And we're in the process of launching Spring Impact Capital, which is an early stage VC fund focused on digital health and climate solutions. So just to give you that's right, let me come back. Great, okay, so goals for today. What we're gonna do is we're gonna talk a little bit about funding cycles, data room structure, starting your investment round, and getting familiar with some terms. I'm hoping for a lot of questions throughout. Sometimes this can be a bit of a fire hose of information, but if you have not raised capital before, you know, it tends to bring a lot of questions about like how, when, why, and I'm hoping to kind of share a lot of wisdom as we go through the process. So please engage throughout the session. If you're gonna ask a question, the first time you ask, if you can just kind of say, hey, my name is, my company is, it'd be great to do that. And then the other thing too is don't be shy to just yell out the word dictionary if I say something and you don't know what it means, right? And so part of this process is to get comfortable in the language of VC and angel. It is a unique language. It's a subset of English, to be sure. And so it's going to be really important just to get comfortable with some of the terms and terminology that we go through. So just a bit about me. So I'm actually a 5-time entrepreneur, a couple times in tech, venture studio, Spring, my existing organization, the Spring Investing Collective, and now the fund is also wrapped into that. I've had the good fortune of advising and supporting a number of organizations in their journey, including capital raising journey. So the companies that I've advised have raised about $100 million. And I've worked with companies like Foodie and Hootsuite and Nada and some really amazing other organizations that I'd be happy to talk to you about. So question for the audience. How many people are actively fundraising right now? Show of hands. Yeah, fabulous. What do you wish you had known before you started? Any comments? Go ahead. Oh, we're going to grab the mic just for the people online, so we'll bring it up here. Thank you. The strategy of fundraising?
No, strategic investors.
Strategic investors, like corporate partners, et cetera. Yeah, fabulous. Good topic. Yeah. Anything else? Anything you wish you had known before or you want to know now? How many people have not had coffee yet? All right, good. Go ahead, up.
The reason I'm not answering is like everything, there's so much.
Yeah, with the doors wide open, right?
Yeah.
Fabulous. Yeah, good. Charles.
My name is Charles. I'm a founder of Zaniheza. Well, so many things, but I wish I had known about the traction requirement that you need to have earned some kind of revenue in order for you to go and raise?
Revenue being one type of traction, absolutely true. That is actually something we're definitely going to be talking about today, which is how do you not only attract the attention of investors, but how do you keep their attention, right? Really critical. Question over, or a comment over here.
Hi there, my name is Tendai. I guess for me, the thing that was hardest to demystify was the type of investors to approach and when in your life stage as a startup.
Yeah, I actually really like that comment. We have quite a diversity of types of investors now, and so there's kind of a myth that exists in the world where you're like, hey, I started a startup 5 minutes ago. I'm going to go to Silicon Valley. I'm going to talk to Andreessen Horowitz, 15 million, right? And so and I'm saying that, by the way, looking in the mirror, like when I had my first startup back in 2002, that's exactly what I did. Is I went down to the valley and I was like, you should look at us. And they're like, who are you? And so you have to figure out that timing. So we will talk about that. Thank you. Sorry, we'll come back to you. Go ahead.
I'm from Mycelium Acoustic Panels. One thing I would want to consider is what is the most realistic valuation of my company, because each type of investor would have a different perspective or a different method of calculation.
Yes, and I'm going to share with everybody here the dirty little secret on valuation. If you all promise right now not to tell your investors. Do we agree? Okay, good. I will tell you the secret behind that. Good. Up at the front here, and then I think we'll keep going. Cheers, just for the people online.
Hi, I'm Doran from Floats VR.
Great.
So what I would like to wish, what I would wish to know now is, I think the number of investors you talk to is a factor, and how do you get to talk to many of them? Because I find that it's a trickle. I get to one at a time, and it's just not.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad that you mentioned that. So I do not have a slide on this, but I will touch on this just so that I can set the tone. So please don't throw your laptop at me when I say this. But the average entrepreneur in your first round, you will speak to a minimum of 65 investors to get a round done. So my encouragement to you is don't be discouraged, embrace the number, right? And then work your way through it. Because what often happens is people are like, great, I'm going to talk to like 15 people and I'm done. Doesn't happen, right? It might happen in your second or third round, when you've got a bunch of momentum, or in your next startup. So I'll give you an example. The first time I raised a round, I spoke to about 85 investors. With my current company, Spring, I raised around in 2016. It was the 5th time I had raised capital. I called 13 people. I was done in a week. But it's because it was my 4th startup, right? So the point is like it just takes a certain amount of brute force. But to your point earlier about who to talk to and when, if you're really good at knowing who you should be targeting, you can get that number down to 40, which actually makes a huge difference for your time. If you do not focus, you will speak to more than 100 and suffer. I'm speaking sincerely. And the reason is there's a cliche term that we all know. And the cliche term is, you never know, right? So you guys go to a pitch event and you're like, hey, there's a pitch event, VEF, pitch event. And I'm going to pitch there because you never know, right? So if you ascribe to you never know, here's your job. What you're going to do is you're going to buy a sandwich board. When you see those people standing on the sidewalk, you're going to buy a sandwich board and you're going to write on it. You're going to put on it, invest in my company. You're going to stand on that street corner for a week because you never know. That's literally what you're doing, right? So if you don't focus on the right investors, you're going to burn a lot of time and energy, and you guys will meet these and other entrepreneurs at other events where you're going to be like, hey, how's it going? And they're going to look like they've been hit by a bus and they're exhausted. And you're going to be like, hey, and they're like, yeah, I've been raising money for 18 months. And then you'll be like, so who's your ideal investor? Well, you never know. You'll hear it every time. And it's hard, right? So don't be that person. We sympathize with those people, but we focus. Does that make sense? Cool. This is good because this is probably the hardest thing to talk about. So if we get it out of the way now, everything else is easy, right? Cool. Okay. Well, we'll keep going. Awesome. So a couple things that's important to dig into. Remember that this is a fair exchange of value, right? So when we're raising capital, the distinction is that instead of selling our product, we're selling a share certificate, or we're selling the promise of some other form of return. And one thing that's interesting to me is that in this day and age, like, you can sell equity in your business, or you can sell the promise of future equity, right? A safe agreement or a convertible note, which we will talk about in a little bit. But nowadays, we also have things like revenue-backed financing, convertible loan vehicles. We have other things. So the important thing is that there's what we call dilutive capital and non-dilutive capital. Dilutive capital is when you're selling shares in your business. You're giving up ownership in your business, right? And non-dilutive capital is all of those other ways to get investment where you're not giving up shares. And so for us as founders, we want to balance that, right? Because we don't want to give away everything, right? We don't want to give away the ownership. And one thing I will share with you is that as a 5-time founder, one thing I've learned over time is when you give up equity, it is the most expensive form of funding for your business, right? Because you're actually giving up percentages of your company, and you're giving up ownership, and sometimes you're giving up control, right? If you give enough shares away over time. And so it's a very expensive form. It can pay off. That's why people still do it to this day and do it a lot. But if you're able to get other vehicles to come alongside, everything from SDTC to NRC IRAP to revenue-backed financing and everything else, it helps you as an entrepreneur to balance what you give up, right? And the cost. Does that make sense? That make sense? Okay, great. Sorry, there we go. So the other thing to remember is that the process of investment, it moves at the speed of relationships, right? So if I have not met you before and I pitch you on my company, you don't know me, right? So it is important to know how many people are doing more than, say, 5 million in revenue. Look around the room. Nobody, right? So the reason I'm sharing that is if you're not doing more than 5 million in revenue and say like 20% net margin, I can't trust your financial statements. So all I can do is look at you and say, do I trust you and your team with my money, right? And if that's what we're doing, we have to build the relationship, right? Does that make sense? So that's something that we really have to keep in mind. So typically speaking, we will talk about timelines here in a minute, but typically speaking, it is not unreasonable for, like, from first relationship to a check, anywhere from 90 days to 12 months, depending on the person. That's the other fun part about this, is you have to remember angel investors, they're not clones, right? And because they're not clones, that means they all have individual hopes and fears and dreams and likes and dislikes and preferences and speed and distractions, right? So don't expect everybody to move the same way, right? So that's something that we need to manage through this. It is the very definition of herding cats, trying to do around. How many people have sold something in their life? Right? So how many of you have tried to take a single sales contract and have 20 customers sign the exact same contract? Right? Very few of us. And that's what it is to raise a round, right? A single contract, and you're trying to get 20 people to sign the same thing. It's a bit of work, right? So for the people who have that experience, you can understand the complexity, but also the potential value of that outcome. So super cool. So in terms of timing, this is very important as we go through the process, which is part of what we're going through here is to decide when we get the money. So one thing a lot of entrepreneurs do is they wake up, say, Monday morning, and you're like, okay, time to raise my round, right? And you're like, great. But nobody actually says, so when do I need the checks in the bank? So the challenge is you have to know when you need the money by. And so this time frame that I have up here is a really important thing to consider, which is raising equity capital takes the longest of any form of capital. So if you need money in 3 months or less, you're not raising equity capital. Just remember that, right? Like, we need to find ways to get from A to B. So one thing to think about, if you are in a situation where you actually need to raise capital and you have less than 12 weeks of cash, I'll ask you a question. How many people know where your cliff is? Like cash equals 0. Okay, so some of you have raised your hand. So first, my encouragement to all of you is like tattoo that date on your arm. Like when are you gonna run out of cash? You need to know, right? And so my comment is if you have more than 6 months of cash, you live in abundance, you can raise capital. If you have 4 months of cash or left, you're gonna have little beads of sweat coming down the side of your head, right? But at 3 months or less, you're not raising. And the reason is because if you pitch me and you're like, hey, Keith, how's it going, da, 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 da. And then at some point in time, I'm gonna ask a question. I'm like, so how much runway do you have? And you're gonna be like, 60 days. So there's 2 types of investors in the world that reflect humanity, right? Remember, angel investors are a subset of humanity, right? And my opinion, 98% are good, 2% are bad, right? So 98% of investors, so the good guys, if you say I have 60 days of cash left, they'll go like this, and they'll be like, hey, keep me posted. And the reason is because they want to see how you deal with adversity, right? And the risk is too high. And then the other 2% will try and take your company. Now, notice the percentages. Please don't lose sleep every day about the bad people in the world, right? If we all did, we'd never leave our house. But those bad investors do exist. It's only 2%, it's fine. But for the rest of us, remember, most of the people, if you have less than 12 weeks of cash, they just won't even write the check. They'll just see how you react. Does that make sense? Cool. Any questions on this? Go ahead. I'll repeat your question just so we don't have to worry about the runner. I'll start with you.
So what's the start point here on this?
Grants and loans?
No, I mean like when you start counting, is it when you offers that your raising fund or?
Good question. Yeah. So the question is, what is the start point for these timelines? So the start point for these timelines is the moment you reach out and call or email. So to your point, like with equity, from the moment you first contact an investor to when the check clears the bank, minimum of 4 months is what you plan for, maximum of a year. Yeah. I want to make sure, like, if we use another cliche term, never say never, like I have seen rounds like start and end in 10 days. Like I have seen that, but I've seen it like we all see people get struck by lightning. You know, like theoretically it happens, but you know, I've seen it happen like statistically, you're thinking 4 to 12 months. Yeah. Because you have to build the relationship. Yeah, it's that trust-based relationship. The other thing to remember too is, you know, when you first pitch me, always put yourself in the mind of the investors, right? So the first time you pitch me, I'm gonna say, hey, how's it going, right? And nice to meet you. I'd love to hear about your company, right? Every single meeting thereafter, I'll be like, hey, so what's new? That's the number one question that's going to come out of their mouth. But the question in their head that they never say out loud is, can I trust you and your team with my money? Right? So if I pitch you and then you're like, hey, Keith, you know, great to meet you. This is interesting. Let's keep the conversation going. And then in the second meeting, you're like, hey, Keith, what's new? And I'll be like, not much. Be the last time we talk, right? Because it'd be like, nothing's happening.
So that's related to what you said that on your second step you're getting better. That's the same reason.
Well, the relationships are built, but the other thing too is notice as well that in this relationship, trust-based relationship, this goes back to Charles' comment earlier about I wish I knew about traction. Because in the first meeting, they're going to fall in love with you, they're going to fall in love with your idea, the market opportunity, everything else. But what cements the deal is progress, right? So progress, by the way, like Charles mentioned, revenue. For certain types of companies, including Charles, actually revenue and user growth is number one. But for some of us, actually, it might be like patents granted, patents pending, strategic relationships, you know, signed and developed, MOUs, LOIs, but we need to keep showing progress along the way. And that's what helps to build trust as well, because we're executing, we're adapting, we're pivoting, we're growing. Xavier.
Yeah, I just have a question regarding trust-based relationships.
Yes.
So I was reading about meeting with investors. So in the previous scenario, let's say less than 3 months of cash.
Yeah.
When you talk to the investor, it's kind of tricky to talk about the urgency of this situation.
Oh, yeah. So the comment for those online is How do we communicate with investors, especially if there's a sense of urgency?
Are you just gonna be like super honest? Or?
Yeah, so are you gonna be super honest? So, by the way, I love to tell stories and I love to make jokes, so I apologize. You don't have to laugh at everything. But the question that you're asking is kind of like when you go to a bar looking for a life partner, right? And so you walk into the bar and you see somebody and you're like, that's my life partner, right? And you say, hi, my name's Xavier. I'm thinking a house, white picket fence, 2 kids, minivan. Like, what do you think? Are we in? You know, like that's the truth. But do you say it? No, right? You're like, hey, how's it going? Right? And so with investors, it's the exact same thing. Remember, investors are human beings, right? So if you walk up to an investor and you're like, hey, I got 60 days of cash left. I really need your investment. Would you do that? No, right? So remember, investors, interestingly enough, in this context are just like the Royal Bank of Canada. When is the best time to get a loan from the Royal Bank of Canada? When you don't need the money. So what you're doing with an investor is you're saying, hey, actually, I'm going to make it. I'm getting there. I'm going from A to B. But if you invest in me, here's the strategic lift that you and I will create together. And that incremental like return and impact and everything else helps us both win. What do you think? Right? So there is sometimes a moment in this process where we actually sit with an investor. Now, sometimes we have the time pressure of the cliff. But the important part is that sometimes we say, hey, listen, we've had a great set of conversations. I think it's time to make a decision. What do you think? Now, that's a fair comment to make. So my encouragement to all of you is if you are meeting investors at the end of the 3rd meeting, so you've had 2 meetings, they've given no indication of in or out, they're just showing interest, right? So at the end of the 3rd meeting, you say, hey, these have been a great set of conversations. And you know what? As we've been having these conversations, I think you'd be a great investor for my company and a great investor in this round. What do you think? Now you're going to get 3 answers, one of 3 answers. One is yes, great, now I know, right? Sales process, right? So yes. The second one, of course, is no, good, now I don't have to waste my time anymore. So then you thank them for their time. Do you know anybody else who might be interested, right? And then the third one is maybe. When somebody says maybe, what does that mean? It's a Canadian no. Right? And so by the way, I speak all over the world, and I always joke. I'm like, hey, if I was an American, I'd say, hi, my name is Keith, but I'm Canadian, so I say, sorry, my name is Keith. If I'm an entrepreneur, I say, I need money, my name is Keith, right? And so in this process, especially in Vancouver, especially in Canada, if you're like, hey, what do you think? And they're like, you know, keep me posted. That's like most of the time, that's a no, right? So now here's what you do. With much love, you put your hand on their chest and you pin them against the wall. And you say, hey, thanks. Like, I'm glad that you're still interested. What can I tell you or what can we do that will help you to get to a yes or a no? You ask that explicit question. As soon as you ask that question, half the people will automatically say, yeah, you're right, I'm actually not interested. Great, thanks, right? But for the other people, they'll be like, well, who's the lead? Or they'll say, well, you know, I'm not really comfortable with your competitive framing. Or I'm not convinced that your revenue model is going to work. And then you're like, thanks, now I've got something to work with. Does that make sense? Never tell them you're running out of cash. As soon as you tell them you're running out of cash, 98% will sit on the sideline, 2% will try and take your company. But for the 98%, the other thing I would say is, it's okay to say, so I had this entrepreneur, true story, 3 weeks ago, they called me and they're like, Keith, I have a problem. And I'm like, great. And they said, I'm running out of cash. And I'm like, what do you mean? And they said, well, we had 3 main contracts and all 3 postponed. So I think I've got about 45 days worth of cash left. And so I said, so what are you going to do about it? And she said, thanks for asking. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to try. But here's our blind spots. Do you know anybody who could help? That's the best answer in the world, right? So I have a problem. We've thought about it. I have a game plan. Here's how you can help. Does that make sense? It's a great way to hit. Bad news is not a bad thing, right? So long as you show that you're kind of working through it, right? Even if you don't have the complete answer yet. Does that help? Okay, great. Great question. Charles, over to you.
My question is about the timeline.
Yep.
I have read and heard that the longer you go through the cash raise, like the longer basically it's going to take you, the harder it's going to be to raise money. And sometimes you cannot control that timeline because you have to build the relationship, but you also have to find the right person to invest.
Yeah, so thanks for asking that. How many people have sold a house before outside of Vancouver? Sorry, it's a trick question. Because of course, if you sell a house in Vancouver, you just need to put the sign up and it's sold. But for the rest of the world, if you're trying to sell a house, there's this interesting component of selling a house, which is you want it on the market long enough to build a bunch of interest and then get the maximum price. But if it stays on the market too long, people start to think that there's mold in the walls and raccoons in the attic. And then you actually have to take the house off the market, paint a bathroom, wait 3 months and put it back on the market, right? So it's the same thing with a round. So typically speaking, what I would say is if you're raising money, if you get to 9 months and you're not more than 50% committed, you need to take the round off the market. Because what happens is like you're pitching, and then what happens is like a year later, you're at another pitch event, pitching again, and all the investors in the room are like, wow, you're still raising? Oh, I wonder what's wrong with this deal. Must be raccoons in the attic. Like legit, right? And there's a tipping point where you just have to take it off the market. And so to your point, there is a tension in there. And typically speaking, I see that tension start to build at the 9-month mark. So you need to try and push towards that. By the way, if any of you are in this process where you're raising right now and you've exceeded the 9-month limit and you're not sure what to do, separate coffee just to talk through how to do that. So there's some very known techniques for how to resolve the timeline problem. Hopefully in saying that as well, one thing I'm trying to encourage you guys is everything that we're talking about here, there's no rocket science, right? There's no rocket science to this. It is a sales process. We're selling share certificates, right? And so there's always techniques to make it move forward and to win. Make sense? Cool.
Hey, Keith from online. I think you cover this later, so feel free to defer. But they're asking the best way to find investors, particularly angels, because they have been looking through LinkedIn, but 65 would be very hard to find, they're saying.
Yeah, so it's a great question. Where to find investors? I think somewhere I might have a slide on this. Investors are found in a few ways. So one is a platform was mentioned, which is LinkedIn. LinkedIn is actually a reasonably inefficient place to go. So AngelList, Crunchbase, Gust, Hockey Stick, LinkedIn, from a platform perspective, those are places that you can go as a starting point. Interestingly enough, Instagram and Twitter, right? Start looking for angel investors. One of the best angel investors that I found in the US who supports BIPOC founders, I found him in Instagram. Didn't find him on any of the other platforms, right? So this is a process where, and I want to make sure we talk about this, is demystifying. We're just demystifying here. You have a target demographic, right? Like in your product, right? In your product, like you guys aren't trying to sell your product to everybody on the planet. You have a very specific defined target market. You wake up Monday morning and you research and you go find them. It's the exact same thing with angel investors. It's the exact same thing with VCs, right? So you open up the Google, right? And you're like, clean tech angel investors. Clean tech angel investors can't. So the challenge is that it's a psychology problem. It's not a research problem. So the last time I looked in AngelList, there were 23,000 people who had identified themselves in the US alone as angel investors. Please don't tell me you can't find 65 people. But what it is we want the problem to go away. How many people here love going into your accounting system every day? Yeah, one person who I'm slightly worried about. Everybody else kept your hands down, right? And so my comment is it's the exact same thing as around. When you wake up in the morning, what do you think? You're like, I don't want to raise money. I want to run my business. You need to actually stop fighting the round and embrace it, right? Because when you find values in industry and sector-aligned investors, they offer huge value. Right? And so you need to say to yourself, actually, I'm going to go do this. I'm going to go find 65 incredible people because when I get 8 to 15 or 20 of them to write a check, my business is going to go boom, right? But what we wanted to do is we wanted to go away. I just want to walk down the street. Somebody, I'm going to walk up to Keith. I'm going to open up his shirt. There's like an ATM there, and 250 grand is going to pop out, and I'm going to, that's what we want. Like let's call. So it's not going to happen that way, right? But if I find you and you're a values-aligned investor and your sector and stage correct, and you understand my industry, huge value. I want to have those calls. You want to have the calls. Embrace that. So sorry, I know that was semi-philosophical, but.
Good morning, our classmates, and thank you for invitation. Up to date, I'm still so far so good. But this small question, you could answer me or not, MIT man. I want to know, keep vigilance or keep track of my customers' trustee, funding, and my progress is by the software called the CRM I know before. Can you recommend any software I could do that in my cell phone or my home PC?
Okay, great. So one thing that I would always say to everybody is, and I'm actually glad that you asked that question, is remember it is a sales process. So yes, we are tracking investors just like we're tracking customers. Last time I checked, HubSpot CRM is free. I think it's still free. The inbound marketing stuff is super expensive, but I think HubSpot CRM is still free. So HubSpot would be a great starting point to track not only investors, but also customers. So it's a great question. Okay, we're gonna dive into more. Love the questions.
What kind of software you can recommend?
The kind of software is CRM and HubSpot. Yeah, you bet. So due diligence, so I'm just going to clarify this term. It's just a fancy angel investing finance term for doing the homework on your company, right? So that's the process of due diligence, and it really starts about 15 minutes into the first meeting, right? So the important part of due diligence is this is our time to shine. This is our time to build trust, right? So as a part of that process, remember, we did a survey, by the way, of our investor community a couple of years ago. So it was a few hundred investors that we were talking to. And one of the questions we asked was, we said, how long does it take you to make an investment decision in a startup? Any guesses as to what people said? How long does it take? Go ahead.
30 seconds.
30 seconds? 5 minutes? Any other guesses? All right, now we need caffeine. So the average amount of time that an investor said was 15 minutes into the first meeting. So what they said was, after 15 minutes, I've met you, I like the idea, I like the opportunity, I've asked you a few questions, you seem smart, you seem coachable. Everything that they do from that moment to the check is validating or invalidating that idea, okay? So if you get to the end of the first meeting and they're like, yeah, let's keep the conversation going, there is interest, right? So now it's your opportunity to build that, and the due diligence process is where we do that. So it is important to note, you'll see a set of questions on the board. Those questions will be particular to the investor, right? So I'll date myself a little bit. There's an investor in town. His name is Jim Fletcher. Jim is now retired as an investor, but when he was active in the marketplace, Jim's background is he's a CFO by trade. So Jim would go into the financials. That's where he would spend his time, because that was his background, that was his expertise, that's where he liked to add value, right? Other investors will talk about strategy, others will talk about sales and marketing. So again, remember, when you're talking to investors, they will ask different questions based on their background and expertise. So our goal is to be ready for the totality of those questions, right? So as a part of that process, they're doing due diligence to learn, to confirm, and to appraise, right? So the first thing is they're trying to dig in, understand you, understand the space, understand the market opportunity, understand your tech, right? So this is the place that they're gonna go. Some investors are savvy enough that they can do their own due diligence on the platform. Some will actually sometimes bring an outsider in to help them assess your tech. And then there's a third camp who will never ask. They just like you and the team, they won't even ask about the tech. Like, it's, again, personal preferences, right? But they're also starting to confirm things. They're also starting to confirm some assumptions. They want to dig in and kind of confirm what they think about you. They're going to poke around and ask questions to their friends and colleagues. And then the last thing on appraise is that's actually the point where they're going to say, is this a good deal? Do I like this deal? Right? And remember, angel investors are not philanthropists when they invest in your company, right? I'm not investing in your company and be like, oh, I get my money, I don't, right? They're expecting a return. They understand there's a lot of risk at early stage, but they're still expecting you to be a good steward of their money, right? So they're going to be looking at the deal and saying, is this a fair deal for me? Does that make sense? Okay, great. So types of due diligence, business, technical, financial, and legal. Legal, typically speaking, is what I will call ticks in a checkbox. So they've already gotten to the place where they love the opportunity. They've answered a lot of questions, a lot of like risk issues. When they get to legal, that's typically speaking where they're like getting ready to get the deal done, right? One area that I will say is that legal is also sometimes where you will get caught. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. Sometimes when we're talking about our business growth and our opportunities, we'll be like, hey, I've got these clients and their customers and the da-da-da-da-da. But customers sometimes are a state of mind, right? So they might still be in the funnel, but they haven't signed anything. Or they've signed a memorandum of understanding, but not a contract. Or they've signed a contract, but they haven't implemented, right? So this is where you need to make sure that you're like, whatever you're telling the investor is correct according to the contracts you have, right? Because you don't, like sometimes when we're talking about things, it's human nature. We're not lying, but we're kind of like, sometimes we're just overly optimistic about where the customer is, right? And so we're like, yeah, he's a customer. And then they're like, show me the contract. Well, it's an MOU, you know? And so, but it's kind of like a customer, you know? So sometimes we have to be thoughtful about that. The other place is the cap table. Does anybody not know what the cap table is? It's okay, like that's why we're here. Okay, fabulous. So the cap table is a breakdown of who owns what in the company. So it is a spreadsheet in effect that lists everybody who owns a share in the business, how many shares, and what percentage. And so the reason is because if I'm investing in your business, Xavier, is it Xavier, Javier? Xavier, okay, thank you. So Xavier gives me his cap table. Xavier is the CEO. So my expectation is that Xavier owns a certain percentage. Typically, as a CEO co-founder, you're expecting something between 25 and 60%. You know, if he's a solo founder, it could be more, of course. But if it's less than 25, that's going to raise a flag. Another one is, say, Xavier, sorry, you co-founded with Lily. But 3 months after, Lily actually said, you know what, this isn't for me, I'm out. So now she's a passive co-founder. So when I look at the cap table, if I see Lily at 50%, that's a problem. So former co-founders or passive co-founders, if they own more than 10%, will create friction in due diligence. And the reason is because investors look at that and they say, hey, who's this person at 25%? And you're like, oh yeah, Chuck, he's like, haven't talked to him in 3 years. And they'd be like, that's too much ownership for somebody who's not involved at early stage. You need to fix that. And a lot of investors will say that. They'll say, fix it and then call me. So I actually have 2 companies that I'm working with right now, and that's exactly what's stopping their round, is they have people who have too much ownership and they're not involved anymore and they didn't fix it. Nobody tells you this in the entrepreneur handbook, right? Where they're like, hey, by the way, if somebody leaves the company, you need to sort that out, right? You only find out when you're like at the altar with investors and they're like, stop, I don't like that. You know, does it make sense? Super, super hard. Go ahead.
What's the main way to protect yourself in that? Is it investing in technical provisions co-founder communities?
So there are a few ways that you can protect yourself. One of the ways is, you talked about vesting. There's a specific method by which you do that as co-founders, which is called reverse vesting. And so if anybody has any questions, I could give you a 15-minute summary or talk to your startup lawyer, either way. But I would say 99% of startups did not set up reverse vesting in the beginning, which means everybody just owns. So there are 3 or 4 techniques by which you can sort it out if they just already own the shares. So trust, again, for any of you who are in this situation, trust that you can sort it out with your lawyer, because there's 3 or 4 ways to get it down to the correct number. Correct number is sub 10%. If they own 10% or less as a passive co-founder, that is okay. Anything more than that's going to create friction. Okay? Happy to talk through those specifics, but that's also why we go through this process and prep. Okay? By the way, there is a takeaway slide which actually breaks down in more detail what goes into our due diligence folder. And I'll just touch on the data room. So this is the due diligence folder, is what we call the data room. And the data room is where we store everything. And this is actually a place for us to jump ahead of the queue and make ourselves really shine in an investment process. So typically speaking, these are the core categories or the folder structure for our data room. So we have corporate information, customer, financials, market, product and ops, legal, and team. And so these are kind of the 7 main structures. Corporate information, by the way, will include your pitch deck, the paperwork of your rounds, the cap table that we just talked about. So that stuff goes into that folder as well. Does that make sense? These are also considerations. If you have not raised capital before, if you are a BC corporation and you're raising money from BC investors, you have the ability to offer them a 30% tax credit. It's called Eligible Business Corporation, or EBC for short. So these are things that sometimes investors will ask. Are you a BC Corp? Are you EBC eligible? So they'll ask, these questions. So that's also where in the corporate information, we'll sort that out. But one of the addendum items that we will offer as a part of the deck is a checklist doc. And the checklist doc that we have has about 35 items that if you're like, hey, what specifically do I put in these folders? You can just use that checklist and start to create it. Does that make sense? So typically speaking, by the way, the folder, you can do it in Google, like Google Drive, Dropbox. There's a few other places, of course, that you can do it. But you're putting everything collectively into a folder. So from a sales technique perspective, one of the ways that we use this now is, say you pitch me for the first time, right? And I say, hey, this has been a great conversation. This is really interesting. I'd love to keep the conversation going, right? And you're like, fantastic. And I'm like, send me a copy of the deck. And you're like, you bet. So then what you do is when you send the email follow-up, what you do is you attach a PDF of your deck. And you include the link to the entire data room. So then you're like, Keith, great conversation. This is awesome. You asked me for a copy of the deck. Here it is, by the way. Here's a link to my entire data room. So now, for me as the investor, I'm like, wow, you're prepared, you're thorough, you've done your planning. I can dig in wherever I want to dig in, right? Does that make sense? So it's a great way for you to stand out, because I will be honest, 95% of entrepreneurs will just send the deck. Bonus marks. Human nature, what do we know about humans? We can't control them, right? So 25% of investors, if you send me your deck, you know what I'm going to do with it? I'm going to share it with my buddies. I'm going to be like, hey, I saw this company, it's awesome. But the problem is you didn't pitch them. So they don't have the context at all, right? So most of our slides, what do they look like? They look like this. Images, no words, no context, nothing, right? So please, when you're ready to pitch investors, have 2 versions of your deck. One is the snazzy visual version, and then the second one is the text-heavy version. The easiest way to build the text-heavy, once you've completed your core deck, create a Loom video of yourself pitching the deck. So when you send a link to the data room and you send a PDF of the deck, share a link of you recorded pitching it. So you're like, hey, listen, by the way, I've attached the deck, but here's a recording of me pitching it if you want to remember the context, and here's my data room. So that if I forward it to somebody, they'll just watch the video. Make sense? Now they have all the context, all the understanding. There's no chance for misinformation. Go ahead, Charles.
Seems like some of the investors I speak to, especially here in the province, they really want to see a business plan. While in the startups, we always hear, You don't need a business plan because we raise with the pitch deck, but it always comes to having a business plan. What is your take on that?
Wow, that's such a good question. So typically speaking, Charles, and I would say this to everybody, the majority of investors I know would never ask for a business plan in the context of like the quintessential 35-page business plan with appendices. The vast majority of investors that I know would never ask for it. They might ask for a 2-page exec summary. That I have seen for sure, and I think it's good to have a 2-page exec summary in your data room and your deck. So the majority don't. Now, you raised an important point. Remember earlier we talked about the fact that investors are human beings. All of you, individual hopes and fears and dreams, different food choices, right? Like we're all individuals. So what Charles is actually reflecting is, yeah, some investors are individuals and they'll ask for a business plan. So if you wanted to hedge your bets and be ready for anyone, yes, build a business plan. However, don't build a 35-pager. Futurepreneur is an amazing organization in Canada, and they support first-time founders pre-launch. And on their website, they have a business plan writer. So my encouragement to you is on a Thursday night, grab a bottle of your favorite beverage, whether it's kombucha or wine or scotch, maybe not scotch, maybe a bit too much, but grab your favorite bottle of whatever you like to drink and set aside 3 hours and go through the writer. And I guarantee at the end of 3 hours, you'll have an 8-page business plan. It's like dead easy. And then that way, on the off chance, like in Charles' case, he's like, hey, somebody's like, hey, send me the business plan. You're like, yeah, I got it. But literally it's 3 hours and that link from futurepreneur.ca, and it's their business plan writer. If you do not have a financial forecast, they do have an addendum, which is a cash flow template, which is a fantastic tool to use. If any of you need a cash flow template, ping me in LinkedIn, and we've got a couple of different templates that we have at Spring. I'd be more than happy to share them with you, okay? So great question, Charles. You're hedging your bets, right? Hedging your bets. I'm actually gonna come up here and then to the back.
Business partner, like investors.
Oh, business partner? No, business plan. Plan. Yeah, no, but I'll touch on that comment. So business partner. So how many people here are solo founders? Okay, keep your hands up. Keep your hands up. How many of you have no staff? Okay, so the majority of you have some staff, but some of you don't. If you are a solo founder with no staff, you will not raise. I'm gonna make it dead easy for you right now. And the reason, and by the way, I'm Gen X, so as a Gen Xer, I would say the problem is the bus rule, right? If you're the only person and then you get hit by a bus, right? But that's Gen X. I'm Gen Y, I would say, oh, you won the lottery and moved to Fiji, right? So there's good way and bad way to view the world. And so my comment to you is, if you're a solo founder with no team, then you have a problem, right? Now, if you have a co-founder, 2 or 3 total founders, good. Investors love 2 to 3 co-founders. If you have more than 3 co-founders, it actually starts to become a problem again. Because statistically, the average successful startup started with 2.23 co-founders. I don't know how you created 0.23 co-founder, but the point is it's all 2 and 3, right? So the concern always is when you have 4 or 5 co-founders, their concern is somebody's gonna pop out the side and create that cap table problem we talked about, right? So it's bad to be 1, it's bad to be 5. But if you are a solo co-founder, like a solo founder, but you have a team, your job is to convince them that even though you don't have co-founders, your team is the right team to get it done. So one thing to think about is when you're pitching the company, and Charles is a really good example, right? So Charles, there's a combination of his, which is like travel industry, it's e-com, it's delivery. So there's 3 main components. So if Charles was the solo founder, he would need to say, okay, I'm e-com, and I'm travel, and I'm delivery. So who on my team ticks those check boxes so that if somebody says, even if there's not a co-founder, there's the right mix of industry and business model expertise, even if they're not co-founders, right? Bonus marks if you have an employee stock option plan so they have a sense of ownership. because that shows commitment, and that's important to an investor because it builds trust. Everything comes back to trust. Make sense? Cool, please. Oh yeah, you build a team. You got to build a team. So now you're going to say, Keith, thanks, but you owe me lunch because how do I build a team when I have no money? Right? So there's a couple of ways that you can do this. So there's concentric circles of team, right? So first is co-founders. Then the next circle is people that you can afford to pay. The next group is the promise of a team. So I'll give an example. Say you come to me and you're like, Keith, you're an amazing developer, software developer. I would love for you to be on the team. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm working at Amazon making 200 grand a year. I'd love to go work at a startup, but I can't work for nothing. So then what you would do is you would get me to sign a contract that's conditional on my round. So then it would say, I agree, I will become the senior developer of your company as soon as you raise a minimum of 500K, and every other term is just like an employment contract. Because then you're like, hey, Keith's on the team, and they're like, well, how is he on the team? And you're like, here. Like, I got it in black and white contract. Now, you and I know, like, stars and moons need to align in a bunch of stuff, but what it shows is that you identified the right person, you lock them in, you've done your homework, and you're ready to go. Now I can trust you even though it's not perfect, right? So now that's the third circle, right? So co-founders, existing team, promise of a team, and then the outside is like the advisors, the board, and other investors, right? So you know when you have those other pieces that wrap around it, that's your team in total. Always present your total team. People start to discount it the farther out you go, like where advisors are kind of like the least valuable. But if you were running like a B2B SaaS company and one of your advisors was Ryan Holmes, people would take you seriously, right? If Ryan is an investor, even more so. Right? So we always think in concentric circles. Does that make sense? Great, go ahead.
So what is the partnership in this one? I have a partner in US or Europe who is ready to sell the product once it is ready.
So, you hear what he just said? Hey, I have a partner. Then he said, I have a partner in Europe. I have a partner in Europe who's ready to sell. I have a partner in Europe who's ready to sell once my product is ready. How strong is that? Medium, right? It's very medium, right? Like on one hand, if you're like, hey, it's actually like Bosch or BMW. Like if it's a brand name that people in the industry know, good. But you need to be like, do I have an ironclad contract? Have they pre-bought? Right? So if it's a letter of intent, it's kind of like a Valentine's card, right? An MOU is kind of like an engagement ring, and then a contract with a pre-buy, now we're at the altar, right? So your job is to every month you need to keep pushing those deals forward so that the first time you pitch me, you're like, hey, I've got an LOI with BMW. I'm like, okay, cool, you know? And then I say to you, I'm interested, let's have another conversation. 3 weeks from now, we have another conversation. You're like, hey, by the way, remember that LOI? We have an MOU now and we're negotiating the contract. I'm like, oh, so how are you gonna do that? Right, so now I'm curious, right? And then 6 weeks later, you're like, by the way, here's the contract. Oh, hey, maybe I should invest in this thing. Do you see how we drive that? So one technique that I want to encourage everybody in this process is you're going to come out of here and you're going to say, I want to raise money and I want to have the cash in the bank by a certain date. So for simplicity's sake, I'm going to say December 15th. Okay? So between now and December 15th, I need to guarantee success in my round. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to look at your goals and objectives as a company between now and the end of the year. And you're going to take a step back and you're going to look at them and you're going to say, so does it look cool to an investor? Does it look compelling? And then what do I need to do in those goals and objectives? What do I need to do to actually guarantee it happens so the investor is like committed? Just in the way that you and I talked about. LOI to an MOU, to a signed contract, to pre-buy, to cash in bank, right? And then a press release with BMW, right? Like those are the steps. So map it out, timeline it, and make it happen. So I'm going to give you a real life example. There's an entrepreneur in town, actually, that Angie and I both know, phenomenal female founder. This was back in 2016, and she's like, hey, I want to raise a round. And she's like, but I don't want to take forever, and I want to guarantee success. So what she did is she took their monthly objectives. So this was in August. So she, like September, October, November, December, she took the objectives and she stuck them on the wall. And then she pulled her whole team in, 8 staff. And she's like, hey, everybody, I have a task. And they're like, okay, great. And she's like, read those. Tell me what you think. And they had all created those objectives together, right? And she had been communicating them to investors. And so they all went over the wall, and they're all like looking at the objectives. And then they all turned around and they're like, yeah. Like literally, she's like, so how do we go, wow? And they're like, well, I think we should like change this, and I think we should do this. And so true story, in 60 minutes, the entire team rebuilt their goals and objectives for the next 4 months. But the fun part for her is she had already communicated those objectives to the investors. So then she got her whole team involved, and they reset the objectives. And so in September, at the end of September, she would send her monthly update email, and she's like, hey, by the way, you know, sales 117% of target, customer acquisition 132% of target, because they had reset them internally. She just neglected to update them on the targets. So every month, September, October, November, she was like, this is what I told you. And we're like 30% over, 50% over, 70% over. And true story, at the end of December, specifically December 21st, because I got the email, and she's like, hey, everybody, I know I'm supposed to send my monthly update email at the end of the month, but I'll be on vacation. So here we are, December 21st. I'm already at 137% of target for the month. So here's where we are on all our numbers. I'm going to close the round in 30 days. By the way, the pre-money valuation is no longer 6, it's 7. She closed 1.5 million in 30 days on that email, right? So one thing to keep in mind as we go through this process, like I articulated verbally to you a brainstorm of how to do that, build the plan, even better, get your team wrapped around it. Because when you execute like that, investors can only do one thing and say yes. Does that make sense? Great. Wow, okay, that exploded. Actually, Lily, you haven't asked a question before, so please.
You are pitching to the investors.
Yeah.
Would you say they look, which one is more important to them? Like, do they really look how your business structures, business plans, like, or would you say more importantly, they want to invest in you as a business owner, the entrepreneur, like, because they believe in you, you're going to develop your business like how they want it to?
So the question being like, are they investing in the business or are they investing in you, right? So, such an interesting question. The short answer is absolutely they're investing in you first. They really do need to like the space and the market opportunity and the product, like, so it's not exclusively you. I will tell you, I have seen a handful of scenarios as both an entrepreneur and investor where an entrepreneur comes along and they pitch an idea and the idea really isn't very good, but people invest anyways. And they're like, yeah, but I just love the founder. Like, so this may or may not work out, but I'm investing in them, you know? And so that does happen, but like it's a 1 in 1,000. So typically speaking, it's like, assuming that, like, so for example, for me, it's like I look at climate solutions, I look at health solutions, I look at sustainable food and ag solutions, right? And so if you come to me with fintech, I'm probably not gonna, like, even if you're awesome, I'm probably not gonna do it, right? But if you're in my catchment area and I think you're awesome, clearly I'm gonna take a long, hard look at it. Like then I focus on the team. So typically speaking, an investor will start with an initial filter, which is, are you in the sector and stage that I invest in? Once you pass that hurdle, it's all about the team, early stage. When you get into A round, it's a bit different, right? Because then you have established traction, established revenue, you've got a more fulsome team. Now they're buying into everything. Does that make sense? Cool. I'm gonna come over here. Bill? Steve, sorry.
Global.
Okay.
Okay, so in the data room, is there any concern that your competition can activate in the data room to see what you're up to?
Okay, so there's a couple layers to that question, which is technically, can a hacker get into your data room? Of course. Second, The larger question that you're asking is, are you speaking to Keith, the investor? Am I engaging with one of your competitors or looking at their deal as well? And is there a possibility of flow through? So what I would say to you is, when I meet investors, typically what I'm doing is I'm doing a bit of homework on them. I'm looking at LinkedIn profile, whatever I can find in social, et cetera. Sometimes you'll stumble across the fact that they've invested in something that looks like you. So then typically what I'll do is early in the first meeting, because pitch decks are everywhere. Like when I'm going through the pitch deck, I'm like, hey, listen, I noticed you invested in this company. Like, where do we stand relative to them? Right? And that's just to gain clarity, because sometimes, honestly, we look at a company in the market and it's actually really not like us at all, but it sort of looks like it. But what I would say is, I remember the 98 and 2 that I talked about earlier? So 98% of investors, if I've invested in one of your competition, like the moment you reach back out, I'll reply and say, hey, listen, thanks, I'm already invested in a competitor, but appreciate the interest. Like, I'm out, right? If investors are investing in competition, that's a flag. Because it's brutally hard to actually maintain like clear separation between the two. So how do you manage the 2%? It's kind of hard, but you do that bit of homework and you do a bit of like social validation on the investor. But the other thing too is the secret sauce really is only in the tech. There's really not much else in the world that's secret sauce. And so typically speaking, you'll have a due diligence in your data room. You'll have a folder for tech, which is 2 folders. So you'll have like a super high level like set of docs around the tech, but very high level, very, very high level. And then you'll have a second folder, and when they click on it, it'll be locked. And then they'll be like, hey, like I'd really like to dig in. You're like, awesome, here's an NDA, right? And those NDAs will have teeth to a point, right? So what I would say is it's also important to understand that while there's, say, 22,000 or 23,000 investors in AngelList, in the grand scheme of humanity, it's a very small community, right? So if you have a situation where I take your stuff and I take it to a competitor, the solution is you just tell everybody. Karma is real in the investor community. And I will tell you, in the last 20 years that I've been doing this, I know of 3 investors who pulled that stunt. And word got around and they never saw another deal, period. And so it hurts you in the near term, but there's always a way to solve it in karma, for sure. Does that make sense? Cool. By the way, so I'm just gonna highlight, I'm gonna go to the very back of the room. And so we have 7 hours, right? We're gonna just keep going. You guys have had so many great questions, but I've literally gotten through nothing, which is cool because we're asking and answering the right question. Actually, all the way to the back first. Sorry, she was first. I will come to you as well.
Yeah, we do have around 25 minutes.
25 minutes.
Yeah.
You have never seen somebody go through 30 slides so fast. I'm gonna do it.
Who generally bears the cost of due diligence?
Say that again.
Who bears the cost of due diligence? Investor or the startup?
Oh. Who bears the cost of due diligence? So there's like legal cost and then there's like time cost, right? And so typically speaking, the cost of due diligence is borne by both sides, right? So in other words, like if I say to you, hey, listen, I need you to like rebuild your forecast, like that's your time and your effort, and you might ask an accountant, and you bear that, right? But then if I am like, oh, I, the investor, I'm now going to have my lawyer look at your paperwork, I bear that cost.
So I'm asking strictly from a legal standpoint, like legal cost, because I have had a startup and there was an angel investor. Their lawyers asked the startup to pay for their legal cost.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to make a comment. Remember I said earlier, you're not allowed to share things with your investors? Any investor who tells you you have to bear that legal cost is not cool. Like that's fair play is, if I say to you, hey, let's negotiate, you want to do a convertible note with this pre-money valuation and this cap and everything else, and I don't agree, like let's change these terms. And you're like, yeah, I agree. Well, then you would pay your lawyer to do that. But if I'm saying to you, I'm gonna get my lawyer to do a bunch of due diligence and I'm gonna send you the bill, that's not cool. So it's the difference between utopia and reality, because there are investors in the world who frankly think they're a rock star. They think they're cool. So they're like, you need me, and so you're gonna bear the cost. And so for me, that is an immediate yellow flag at a minimum. And so typically speaking, what I would do is I would push back and I would say, hey, listen, in the relationship that I've had with my other 15 investors, I bear this cost, they bear that cost. Is that okay? And if they're like, if you won't bear it, then I'm out. You might say, that's okay, because it's probably a sign of things to come, right? So I think that's a super important question. These are the signals that people give us, because remember, if you sell me one share in your business, what has happened? We're married for your business life, right? So these are the signs, right? So like if you're dating somebody, you go to 10 restaurants in a row, and every time the bill comes, they're like, you know, right? Like it's a sign. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just telling you it's a sign, and you need to discern what's right for you. Does that make sense? It's a great question. Thank you for asking. We have a question here.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Puya. I am one of the 3 co-founders of MAP. I had 2 questions. My first one was kind of off what Liddy asking earlier. You mentioned that the co-founder or the investors want to invest in people. And I was just wondering, what's the key to leaving a good impression? What sort of traits do you want to exhibit in your meeting that leaves a strong impression for your investors? They're like, okay, I like this co-founder.
Yeah. First, be yourself. Don't try and be anybody else. Don't try and be somebody more technical than you are. Don't try and be Elon Musk. Don't try and be Bill Gates. Like, just be yourself, right? If you're natural and you have that kind of natural way about you, that, you know, that helps you to be likable. The second thing is you need to show in some way, shape, or form that you and or your co-founder team get the space and or get the business model, or you've had some personal experience that is why you started this thing, right? Sometimes that's a little bit hard if you're like, hey, intellectually, I see an opportunity there and none of us have any experience, but we're just gonna go after it. Sometimes you have to kind of bridge that gap. So the way you would do that is show how much like extensive customer discovery and market research and everything else you've done to start to become that expert. The surrogate for industry expertise or business model expertise or business experience is traction. That is the best way to deal with that. And then how you show that effort is when you're meeting with an investor and you're talking to them, you're like, hey, you know, we came up with the idea, we did our customer discovery, we built an MVP, we've launched it in the market, I have LOIs, MOUs, I have customers, I have revenue, like whatever. Like the more that you can show that you can get there, right? So how many of you are pre-launch? Right, so it's important to note with pre-launch is it's absolutely the hardest time to raise money, because most investors will look at you and say, so only when you launch. Because it's proof that you can get there. Now, for some of us to realistically launch, it will take us like $3.5 million, and like a series of prototypes and IP and everything else. So you need to show a surrogate way for how you're getting there. Right? So patent applications, pilots, proof of concepts, research studies, like all those things that show progress, right? So show progress. Okay, great question. Okay, so you guys have been asking a million amazing questions, all of which are hyper relevant, but I am gonna blast through some stuff in the last 20 minutes just so you have it. Remember, you're gonna get a copy of this deck. I will also offer, so Spring has an online learning management system, which is private to our companies, but we've been a partner with New Ventures BC forever. So if you guys want access to our investment readiness course, which is like a series of videos with tools and templates and stuff, like if you guys want it, just talk to Angie. All I will need from her is a set of names and email addresses. I'll give you access to it. You guys can have access all the way through to the end of the program and the finale. So don't feel like there's like 3 or 4 questions we didn't get to and it's a problem. Like I'll give you immediate access, you'll know, okay? Great, okay, I'm gonna blast. So the shareable we talked about, Dropbox, Google Drive, etc. So tools like Orange Docs or Carta are ways for you to track engagement, right? So you say, hey, Keith, here's a link to the drive, but then you don't know what I do with it. But with tools like Orange Docs and Carta, you know when Keith logged in, What file did he access? How long did he spend on it? So it's a great way to track engagement. And so the NDA I talked about, typically speaking, you will never ask an investor for an NDA pre-pitch. Because remember, investors see hundreds and hundreds of pitches, right? So you ask for it when they're ready to look at the tech, unless you have some very sensitive business contracts as well, right? So there is a role for an NDA, but use it at the right time, okay? And then monthly update emails I talked about. If anybody wants a template for a monthly update email, I do have that as well. But it's a great way for you. It's a BCC list, right? And you're sending it to all of your investors every month to be like, here's the progress we made, here's the lessons learned, here's the big wins, here's what's coming up. Always include one ask, always include one thank you, okay? Does it make sense? Okay, good. So we'll blast through that. So just some tips and tricks on this particular stage. So have your co-founder agreements early. If you do not have formalized co-founder agreements now's the time to do it. Reverse vesting can help, as we talked about earlier. On a personal level, if you guys have $100 in your bank account and you're running a startup, human nature, founders will invest in their startup to the level of their wallet. So one example I'll give you, you want to check out travelercollective.com. Daryl McIver, when he started travelercollective.com, he had $3,000 in the bank. So guess how much money he invested? $3,000. Now I know another founder who will remain nameless, comes from wealth, and he spent $4.4 million to get to an MVP because he had it. So investors always do that. We all spend all of our money. So my encouragement to you is at the end of the day today, go home, look at your bank account, take half the money out, stick it somewhere that you can't access it, and don't put it in the money. Don't put it in the bank, in the startup. And the reason for that is because you are the bank of last resort. When the going gets tough, only you will invest. So make sure you reserve some cash for that rainy day. Does it make sense? Okay, great. And I'll keep going. I'll just blast you this. So 8 steps to get started. You're gonna first set your goals for the round. One thing that's very important, remember we said, like, when do you want the cash in the bank? So first, the most seasonal business, more or less, in the world, any guesses? Chocolate, right? 50% of all chocolate is sold in the 6 weeks leading up to Christmas, right? So it's the most seasonal business. Second most seasonal business, angel investing, right? In my 20 years of doing this, the number of checks that I've seen written between July 1 and August 31st, 6. 6 checks in 20 years. So if you create your deadline and you're like, hey, Keith, I want to raise my round by August 15th, I'm like, nah. You're either going to raise it by June 30th or you're going to raise it by September 30th, but it ain't happening in the summer. Why? Because angel investors are what? Wealthy. They go on vacation, right? And they're out of pocket. And it's the same thing for the month of December. Now, if you're in Vietnam, you actually lose them from the middle of January to the end of Feb because of Tet holiday and everything else, right? So first things first, wherever your investor is, no seasonality. And you need to figure out your timing according to seasonality. You will not get a check from July 1 to August 31st. You will not get a check from December 5th to January 15th. I'll buy you dinner if you do, okay? Cool. Make sure your lawyer is a startup lawyer. If your lawyer is not a startup lawyer, you need, with much love, to fire your lawyer and get a startup lawyer. This is very specific terms and terminology, right? You would not get a drywaller to do your electrical. Please don't do that, right? Build a forecast. If you're pre-launch, 1 year is sufficient. If you're post-launch, 3 years is ideal. 5 is probably excessive, but it might show that you understand certain dynamics in your industry that are peculiar to that industry. Make sense? Bonus marks, base case, best case, worst case. If you're like, Keith, how do I define what a worst case and a best case is? I'll give you the starting point. You have a base case. For worst case, either cut your revenue or your round in half, and can you still get from A to B? And then for best case, what if your revenue doubled or your round doubled? And where would you get to? So I'll give you an example. I was raising money in the last tech startup that I was running, and we were raising $500,000. We had $400,000 in the bank, and I was pitching an investor, and the investor said, hey, like, you know, give me your pitch. And I was like, great. So we were meeting one-on-one, and I gave him the pitch, and he's like, hey, I'm in. And he's like, how much do you want me to invest? And I had 100 grand left, and the guy was from Seattle. So I'm like, oh, exchange rate. I'm going to go for it, right? And I'm like, hey, like, I know the average investor will put in 50K, but like, here's why I'd love for you to put in 100. And he's like, what if I put in 400? It's exactly what he said. So I just, boom, to my appendix slide, and I was like, this is what I do. Because I had best case. And he's like, okay, I'm in. So on the spot, in 27 minutes, I went from a 500K round to $1 million round because I had it ready. Does that make sense? You will be amazed. I see that happen at least once a month, where investors just fall in love with the idea, they fall in love with the business, and they're like, yeah, like, will you take more? Now, you don't have to take it. It is optional, but if you're open to the idea, be ready for it. Because the last thing you want to do is be like, ooh, another 400K, yeah, I have no idea. You know, they'll be like, okay, I'll just give you the 50, you know? Oh, you know? So, okay, cool. Step 5, start your due diligence folder, build your pitch deck. Notice build pitch deck is 6th on the to-do list, right? This is the other thing about, like, you know, Dragon's Den and everything else. You're like, oh, job 1, pitch deck. Nope. Have your goals lined up, have your scenarios lined up, have everything else ready to go. Your pitch deck is built off of what you've gained in experience and wisdom of putting all that stuff together to know really where to focus. Does that make sense? We've done our homework. Warm intros are always best. If you need to cold reach out, you can do that. But remember that it takes work. It's a sales process. I see a lot of entrepreneurs, you're pitching me, like, you reach out in LinkedIn, you're like, Keith, I'd love to pitch you. And then I don't reply, and you're like, oh, you know. How many people in cold call selling, how many of you would call just once? Exactly, you wouldn't call just once. Like, typically speaking, you would be like, I'm gonna call Keith, and then 5 days later, I'm gonna call him again, and then I'm gonna send him an email. Like, it's a sales process. So I was using Ryan Holmes as an example earlier. I know an entrepreneur who reached out on LinkedIn, and they're like, hey, Ryan, I'd love for you to invest in my company. I'd love to give you a pitch. No reply. So then they kept pinging him. And on the 7th one, they're like, hey, listen, good news. We just won this thing, da-da-da-da-da. We've got like 350K in revenue. And I just, you know, thought it'd be like exciting for you to hear that. And then, P.S., are you starting to sense how tenacious I am? Question mark. He replied in 15 minutes and invested in the business, right? 7 tries, right? So it is a sales process. So please do remember that. Managing the funnel. So this is a very important part of managing the process. Remember, you're gonna get a copy of this deck, but you have an initial call and meeting. They establish, at the end of that first meeting, they're like, yeah, sure, let's keep going. 10% probability to close. Follow-up meeting, due diligence. Now, notice number 5, right? You know, you're pitching me and I'm like, hey, yeah, I'm in for 25K, right? Remember we talked earlier about meeting number 3 to determine if they're in. When I say that, I'm only 50% in. Now you need to get me to the check, right? And the reason is because I'm a person, right? And so I got a lot of stuff going on. Amongst other things, I probably have 3 other, you know, companies pitching me today. So I might love you today, and then you guys pitch me, and then I'm like, actually, you know, sorry, I'm gonna invest in them, right? But I've also had situations where people have said, my wife and I decided that we're gonna renovate the bathroom. I've had that. I've had inoperable brain tumor. I actually did have an investor die in a car crash between verbal commit and check. I had somebody go climb a mountain in the Himalayas and disappear. And so the last time that I raised around in 2016, this guy, Steven, I had pitched him. He's like, yeah, I'm in. I'm like, great. And so June 10th, I sent the emails. I'm like, okay, here's the banking info, like, wire the money. And then I didn't hear from him. So, that's weird. That's not like him. So then, like, a couple days later, I'm like, hey, just, you know, top of the inbox, you know, nothing. So then I started calling around, and I'm like, hey, like, does anybody know where Steven is? And he's like, no, haven't heard from him. So now we're all starting to worry, right? And we're like, what's going on? September 12th, my phone rings, and it's Steven. And I'm like, oh my God, what happened to you? Like, I'm so glad. First, I'm glad you're alive. You know, like, this is great. I'm like, what happened? He's like, my wife and I decided last minute to go on safari in Africa. Just got back. Is the round still open? You know, So just as an aside, and I do this for my own sanity's sake, if you verbally say you're in, I always hold the round open. Because sometimes when people are like, hey, I've been gone for 3 months, but I guess your round's closed. I'm like, no, I held it open just for you. I love doing that. Like if you guys want a little payback as a founder, hold it open, you know? So, and then what we do is we get into additional due diligence because I verbally say I'm in, but then I might ask more questions, right? And then we get into the paperwork and negotiation and so forth, right? So that's the process that we go through. I do want to highlight something to you. For the first 6 or 10 investors, when you're pitching your round, you might say, I have a safe agreement, or I have common shares, like whatever your paperwork is. Don't say that. For the first 6 or 10 investors, you're like, hey, I'm thinking safe agreement on these terms. What do you think? So your goal is to get the first 3 to 10 investors to kind of coalesce around what the paperwork is. Then you can kind of cement it in. So don't, because if you say it's a safe agreement, the only answer I can give you is yes or no. And some investors don't like certain types of paperwork, right? So I might not like a safe, or I might not like a convertible note. So if you say, hey, Keith, I'm thinking convertible note, I'm like, I really just like safes. And you're like, okay, well, tell me why you do that. Okay, I can change, right? So remember always the paperwork, whatever is on the top of the page is irrelevant. Common shares, preferred shares, convertible notes, safe, it doesn't matter. All of what makes it fair or unfair to you are the terms and conditions in it, right? So you actually, like my personal opinion is, as a pre-seed seed round, you don't care what the paperwork is. You care about the terms and conditions. So if Keith falls in love with a convertible note, you can do one if the terms and conditions are right, or a safe or a commons. Does that make sense? If you guys ever have any questions about paperwork, like in depth for your company at this stage, I'd be happy to grab a coffee and talk about it, okay? So an investor is not your ATM. Please remember that. Please, please, please remember that. Don't treat an investor like an ATM. They're a human being, build a relationship. It's so easy to be like, hey, invest. Don't do that, right? Like, this is my company. We're going to be awesome. If we do this together, it's going to be more awesome, right? So build that rapport and relationship. We talked about this one, that's great. Finding alignment. So remember, we are giving up shares. We don't want to give our shares to anyone, right? So we're looking for industry experience, business model experience, values alignment. Now, the other thing too is the number 6, it says how and when do they get their ROI? So one question that is often not talked about is, when do you plan to exit? Specifically when? Like not month, but time frame. Right? And so that's a very important conversation to have with a founder or with an investor, because investors have time horizons too. So there's an investor that Angie and I know in town. His name is Haig Ferris, who I think is like 87 years old or so. But up until a couple of years ago, he was still like either the most active or the second most active angel in town. And Haig is like, well, I'm in my 80s. I'm independently wealthy. I don't care. I don't care when the return is. I want you to leave a legacy. So there's a company in town called Wave Computing. It's the world's first commercially viable quantum. He was the first angel in. He didn't care when he got his return because he wanted to change the world. Like, he wants legacy. But other investors are like, I want you out in 3 years. Like, my time horizon is 3 years or 3 to 5 years. So your goal is to figure out, are these people lined up? And the reason is because I find that's the #1 source of friction post-round. So I'll tell a funny story. I was in my first startup and I inherited the CEO chair. So we had some previous investors and we raised around, and then about 6 months later, one of the previous investors called me and Steve was like, hey, Keith, how's it going? I'm like, great, how are you? We catching up and he's like, hey, so I want my money back. I'm like, pardon? And sometimes an investor will call and say they have medical emergency, or remember, they're human beings, stuff comes up, right? And sometimes they'll call you and say, can you get me out? And there are times where we will do that. We'll work our butts off to get them out because their personal situation really necessitates. But so I was like, is everything okay? Are you guys good? He's like, yeah, no, my wife just we want to buy a boat. And I'm like, cool, not my problem. And so he got mad. And I'm not joking. My phone rang every day 3 times a day for 7 weeks. He's like, I want my money, I want my money. And then his wife called me and da-da-da-da. And then they got his lawyer to call me. And I was like, it's like, I'm sorry, dude. Like, early stage code. We told you we were going to try for at least 10 years. Like, you're only at the 3-year mark. Call me in 7, you know? And that happened. So there is another example in Vancouver where a company had raised a round, and they were like, hey, we're the next Instagram. It's going to be $1 billion company. It's awesome. And then a year and a half later, somebody came along and offered to buy the company. Now, the 2 co-founders were 24 when they started the company. So at like 25 and a half, they were both going to be high single-digit millionaires. So these guys are like 25. They're like, oh, yeah, gravy train, you know? And so they went to their investors, and they're like, hey, we're going to sell the company. And the investors are like, nah. The investors killed the deal because they're like, I don't want a 1.5x or a 2x. I bought in for you to change the world to give me a 20x. So that is not shame on the investors. That is shame on the founders. The founders weren't honest. You have to be honest, right? If you plan to retire with your company, please tell the investors. You plan to sell it in 2 years, please tell them. Some people will opt out, some people will opt in, but that's the point. Then they're all aligned. Make sense? Sweet. Tips and tricks. My last section. Remember, always, it's a relationship. Right? So my first company, I had the very good fortune of selling that. My second company failed. The next company that I did, every investor from the second company invested. Because I built relationships and they trusted me. Sometimes the company doesn't work out. That's okay. It has nothing to do with your company. It has everything to do with you as people, as founders, and the relationships and the people you do it with. Every single investor from that company invested in my next company. Make sense? Okay. The next one is we need to really be thoughtful about who we want in on the company. Take the time to get to know the investors, right? Like, are they a fit, right? So one piece of advice that I like to give is, how many people have interviewed people for jobs? It's a trick question, most of you have. Great. So how many of you have asked for references? Okay, so why do you ask for references? To make sure they're a fit. So show of hands, how many people have asked your investor for references? Exactly. So when you're talking to an investor and you don't know them from before and you're getting to know them and you're like, hey, like, this has been a great relationship. I'd love to talk to like one or a couple of the CEOs that you've invested in. I'd love to know how they really got the maximum value of the relationship with you, which is code for, I want to find out if you're an axe murderer, right? And I will tell you, I probably get 1 or 2 investors a year who call me and they're like, hey, you know, Xavier is like one of your companies, right? I'm like, yeah. And they're like, I figured, because he just asked me for references. And I'm like, so what do you think? And he's like, smartest question I've heard all year. Because I'm going to own a piece of your company. Don't you want to do references with somebody like that? Always ask for references. And they love it every time because it means you're doing your homework, you're finding alignment, right? You're going to try and maximize value, so it's hugely valuable. The other thing is keep calm and drive the bus. And what I mean by that is this is your company. It is your round. It is your cap table, right? So you set the terms up front. If any investor ever says to you, we will set the terms, the answer is, love you, but no, my company, right? Because you need to show that you have the leadership to know what your company is worth and how you go and get that. Does that make sense? So I'll give you an example. There's a company that I was working with and they were raising 300K and they had a lead investor. And then, you know, we met and they're like, yeah, like, you know, we're just gonna get the paperwork signed and then we're gonna have a closing party, like, you know, whatever in 30 days. So I was like, fabulous, you know? But then I hadn't heard anything. So like, I don't know, 45 days or 2 months later, I called them and I'm like, hey, how's it going? And they're like, yeah, it's going all right. And I'm like, hey, so what happened with the round? And they're like, yeah, we're still waiting. I'm like, what do you mean you're still waiting? Like everything was in place. And so they're like, and they didn't have an answer. So then I'm like, you know what? I'm going to play dumb and I'm going to ask you a bunch of silly questions until I get to the root of this. And so we were talking about different things, negotiation terms, this, that, and we got the paperwork, and I was like, well, so what about this? He's like, well, it's actually with the lawyer. And I'm like, well, dude, like, get it from your lawyer. Oh, well, it's actually not my lawyer. It's the investor's lawyer. Because they said, hey, you're a startup, don't spend your money, just use my lawyer. So, the client is who? The investor. So the startup would call and say, do this. So what would the lawyer do? Nothing, because they're not the client. So the investor was sandbagging, right? They were waiting for, to kind of grind down. So I was like, oh, no. Like I said, so we were meeting and I was like, I literally pulled up my phone and I said, call a lawyer and fire him right now. And then I found out the accounting firm was also the investors. So what we did is we literally, in 10 minutes, we fired his lawyer and his accounting firm. In the next hour, over phone, we talked to 3 startup lawyers in town, 3 accounting firms, 15-minute calls. It's a bang, 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 bang. He picked his lawyer, he picked his accountant. 3 weeks later, all the money was in the bank. Drive the bus. Your round, your terms, your lawyer, your accountant. Make sense? Okay, great. If at any point in time, by the way, if you ever feel like you can't control it, call me. Glad to walk you through it. Okay? Monthly update emails. I've done this pitch, Angie knows, I've done this pitch, I don't know, 5 or 6 years in a row, and we do this pitch a lot. I would say, typically speaking, coming out of here, after talking about monthly update, a maximum of 5% of you will send a monthly update email. The good news for you who are the 5%, that means you're the top 5% of startups. Because nobody else is sending the update, right? So you're top of mind, you're reminding them that you're awesome, you're showing progress. So fun fact, I've done 5 rounds of capital. Every single round I've done, I have closed an investor without ever speaking to them, just by using the monthly update email. So somebody with like month 3, month 4, month 5, they'll get the monthly email and they'll be like, I get a reply and they're like, Keith, great update, I'm in. Never speak to them. I know who they are, like, don't get me wrong, not a stranger, but that's the point, right? Use it, it's a sales tool. Oh yeah, and then when life happens. So as I said, like people go on safari, they pass away, like life is life. Well, let's not hide, about the good and bad of life, right? So the one trick that you will use is if you want to raise 500K, get verbal commits on 700. Because between verbal commits and the checks, you'll lose some, right? So an example I'll give you, a founder, actually, Angie and I can share this later if she knows him, and he was raising 500K, and so then, he called me one day, he's like, good news, he said, I've closed my round, and I'm like, well, you've already got the cash? And he's like, no, but I've got verbal commits on 500. I'm like, well, you're not done. Like, you need more, because somebody might walk away, no, it'll be fine, right? 30 days later, he called me, he's like, Keith, I have a problem, and I'm like, what? He's like, I'm at 385K. Because people had backed out. So then we mapped out a plan, we got him up to 685 on verbal, and then he closed on 575, right? So always push over, and then the benefit for you is if you have more capital actually at the check, you get a couple of benefits. One is your choice. You don't have to take it all, you can just take the best. But the other thing too is if you're willing to take more than what was originally planned, the term is oversubscribe, which means that I had intended 500K, but I've raised more than 500K. If you want one great piece of PR, oversubscribe your round, right? Because then you're like, hey, so Acme Co, just raised, 650K. And then in the press release, yeah, we were raising 500, but we oversubscribed. We've got some amazing people, da, 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 da. And then people are like, oversubscribe. Company's hot, founders are amazing, bunch of people are in. Now I have FOMO, right? So now I talk to you and I'm like, hey, can I be in on the next round, right? So watch, like if you guys watch the press releases, like Vancouver Tech Journal, which is gold, Beta Kit is also good. Like watch how people use that. It's a killer tool. But remember, always it's your choice. You don't have to take it all. You can say no to the extra, but give yourself the power of choice, okay? And that's it. That's what I got. Yes, that's what I got. Go ahead.
Oh, actually, sorry. We are out of time. So
Angel's
sorry.
Like, we're cut off.
So sorry. First, thank you, Keith.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really great energy in the room. Appreciate it. Keith, can you stick around for a few minutes if people want to chat with you afterwards?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
happy to.
we've got about 5-ish minutes to just turn over to the next topic, which is on HR for startups. But so take a break. But yeah, Keith is here, and if you need to talk to him for more than 5 minutes, we have a great lobby out there to continue the conversation.
Happy to chat. By the way,
Yes.
everybody, if you want, please connect with me in LinkedIn. You'll get the resources, but connect with me in LinkedIn. There are only 2 Keith Ippels in the world. The other one is my dad. He's a very lovely 84-year-old man. Please connect with him too if you want, but I'm the Vancouver one. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.